But joining us now is Ambassador Ann Patterson. She's currently the president of the U.S. Qatar Council. She's a former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and to Pakistan. Most recently, Ambassador Patterson served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs 2013 to 2017. Ambassador, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
I want to go to the Middle East. People are shocked by this. Nobody saw this coming. We've got a new election coming up in Israel. Their government collapsed yesterday. They have to have what I guess they call a snap election there, and they called it for September 17th. Netanyahu, won the election, and then his government collapsed. What happened?
Well, yes, this is the first time, I think, in Israeli history that this has happened. He couldn't make a coalition. He couldn't form a coalition with Lieberman, who's an Israeli of Russian descent, and frankly, a longtime personal. It's not just about politics, but also about personalities. Lieberman represents a large constituency of Israelis of Russian descent who are very, very secular, and they advocate that Orthodox Jews should serve in the Israeli military, and that's where they broke ranks with Netanyahu, because Netanyahu needs the support of the religious parties who historically have not served in the Israeli military. They couldn't reach an agreement. Again, I suspect much of it is personal and not just policy. So he called for new elections. They dissolved the parliament and called for new elections.
So what will happen, do you think?
I think everyone says he's now, people say, at risk for legal issues, and that he could have basically the immunity would not be as strict as it would have been if the parliament had been able, or the Knesset had been able to pass a law. But look, Bibi Netanyahu is about to surpass Ben-Gurion as the prime minister of Israel. I think it would be a mistake to write him off. He's proved to be a enormously resilient and canny politician. So by all accounts, I think the betting is that he will win the next election. Whether he can form a coalition, we'll see. But I think it would be a mistake to write him off. I suspect he'll survive this.
Is it a parliamentary election? Is it also for Netanyahu's position for prime minister? I mean, does
yeah, they have a parliamentary system. So basically, he's got to win. He had 35. It has 120 members of the Knesset. He had 35 seats. He has to basically get the remainder up to 61 through other parties. Israel has an enormously, by American standards, fractured political system where lots of parties have 5 seats. So you have to go around and you have to get all these parties to join you. So they would have to vote for him. But his party got the most votes in the Knesset in the last election, which was in April, and he just ran out of time legally to form a coalition. Basically, Lieberman called his bluff. So he will probably be reelected. Likud will probably do well. He will probably be called upon to form the next government. Again, my personal view is he'll probably survive.
So at the impromptu presser today, one of the reporters asked the president, who do you think is going to win, and would you like to see Netanyahu win? And he said, well, I haven't yet decided to back anybody there or endorse anybody. I mean, you served the Middle East, Ambassador, for a long time. I knew the president, it was impromptu. He was in a hurry. The question probably caught him by surprise. But shouldn't he stay out of a foreign country's government election? I mean, is that really the role for the president to back one candidate over the other?
He should absolutely stay out of it, just like we want foreign governments to stay out of our domestic politics. But frankly, everybody knows that President Trump has a close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And this complicates, I think, the peace plan that Jared Kushner and Mr. Greenblatt were going to roll out in the next few weeks. But, yes, of course he should stay out. But I think that's a lot to expect at this point.
So, peace plan do they still roll it out now, or do they wait? I mean, how do they roll it out in the middle of an election where you can't form a government? I mean, how does that
Well,
even
that's
work?
going to be hugely difficult, and I'm sure they're struggling with that right now. They were going to have a meeting in Bahrain in a few weeks, and they had called together many Middle Eastern countries, rich Gulf countries, and they'd called together some American corporations to try and come up with an economic plan for the Palestinians. And I don't know what's going to happen to that now. It's hugely difficult with all the turmoil in Israel right now, I think.
Yeah, it would seem to me that when they evaluate this, and of course this just happened yesterday, so it would seem to me that when the Trump White House and the State Department and Mike Pompeo evaluate this, I think cooler heads are going to prevail. They're not going to get anything done when they don't even have a government formed and there's a new election. Two parties are running and there's politics involved. You're not even going to get anything even remotely accomplished there. So I think you just wait until after September 17th, see what happens. And we'll
that would be my view. And the last thing I would think they want would be to inject this peace plan in the middle of one of the most controversial elections in Israel's history. I think that would, first of all, it would immensely aggravate their ability to have a successful peace plan. So I would, if I were giving them advice, I would certainly advise them to wait until after the election. But we'll see what happens.
Ambassador, you just said this is one of the most controversial, important elections in Israel's history. What makes you say that?
Well, it's simply never happened before, and if in fact the prime minister does have serious legal problems, I think it's going to throw the whole system into some disarray. And frankly, John, when countries, as we all know from our own experience, have domestic problems, it's much more difficult to focus on foreign threats and foreign affairs. So I think they're going to be hugely absorbed in their own domestic dramas over the next few months. And it's going to be very hard for them to focus on Iran. They've been actually amazingly quiet about Iran recently, and Syria and all the other issues in the region. But again, I think the Israelis have, despite all its chaos and drama, they have a well-established political system, and my suspicion is that they'll come through it okay.
That Netanyahu is resilient, he wins, and he gets a new coalition together. But it is interesting, Ambassador Ann Patterson, what you just said is they have been very quiet. It's almost like every day you're looking, when I scour what I'm going to talk about, I'm always looking for something coming out of Tel Aviv, and I haven't gotten anything in weeks of any meaning. We haven't even talked about it. And I guess that's because he's focused on trying to get a government together, and he can't worry about what is going on in Syria or some of these other regions. Joining us for a second segment, we're so excited and blessed to have her, former ambassador, Egypt for the United States and Pakistan for the United States, Ambassador Ann Patterson. She is currently the president of the U.S.-Qatar Council, and she most recently served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs 2013 to 2017. She's very dialed in, and she's gracious enough to be here for a second segment. Ambassador, thank you. So I was at an event last night, and one of my very good friends that served in Congress told me, the problem that the president's got in the State Department right now in getting some of these nominees through, and specifically we talked about Scott Taylor, my former Congressman, 2nd District, Virginia, being named as Qatar ambassador.
Yeah.
And I said, what is going on with this nomination? Because he's been cleared. There's no signature gate. That was the holdup. And he's like, look, they're just understaffed. And he told me the name of somebody, Lindemann or something. I couldn't think of it. And he says, look, they basically got one guy that's running 5 desks, like the Gulf, the Middle East, this, that, and they just don't have the staff in there to get anything done. They got 1 or 2 people doing 6 or 7 jobs. True or false?
Well, yes, there's basically the whole place is understaffed. That's absolutely true, and in some respects that's been true for years. I don't think it would affect the nominees because a lot of that is handled by the Office of White House Personnel. And John, I saw this during the Clinton administration too, when there are domestic issues and all these subpoenas and investigations and all that sort of thing, the White House basically sort of comes to a stop, and it's very unfortunate. And they don't process sort of normal work. I don't want to blame the nominee issue on the White House, but that sort of thing is a huge distraction. But yes, the State Department is understaffed, and they've had a lot of people leave, and they need to replenish. And certainly overseas, many of our posts are still vacant. They got General Abizaid's in Saudi Arabia, of course, thank God, and finally, and Matt Tuller's in Iraq, but we still don't have an ambassador in the UAE or in Qatar or in Egypt or in Jordan. And that's sort of a tragedy.
It is a tragedy beyond belief. And I asked him, I said, well, is it because of Rex Tillerson that he just got the place when he was there because he was trying to run it like Exxon? And he said, not really. He got rid of some people, but he had no impact. The guy was like a non-entity there. But look, here's the president. He's in the third year, and we have key positions open with no ambassadors, and nobody even in the docket, like nobody even in the system. Like their names haven't even been put forward. It's one thing you put forward the name, and they're bottled up in somebody's committee, or they can't get out of foreign relations. And so that brings us back to Scott Taylor. We're trying to figure out, we keep hearing, okay, he's going to be nominated for ambassador to Qatar. Everybody I talk to says, oh my God, great choice, well qualified, got the signature flap behind him, got exonerated for that. And like, now what's the holdup? Do you have any idea?
I don't know what the holdup is. I mean, again, there's so many, this process, frankly, this whole nomination process has gotten so complex and confused over the years that there are many places that this could be held up. Sometimes they pre-brief nominees to Congress. Sometimes they don't. So you never know if some member has raised some objection that hasn't surfaced, or did he not sell a piece of stock that he was supposed to sell? It's really hard to tell because the process is so cumbersome. But all I can say is that to have these countries without ambassadors, really throughout the whole Trump administration, is a crying shame, and it has enormous policy implications, because the leaders of these countries, as good as our career people are as chargés, they want to talk to a confirmed ambassador who's the president's representative.
Right, exactly. I mean, that, especially when you have key countries in the Gulf and whatever. I mean, they don't really want a career person. They would prefer to have an appointee of the president that they know has the administration's ear on a different level. And it's also the kind of a cultural thing that goes on. So I get that, but these positions really have to get filled, which brings me to the Gulf. You know, recently the Trump administration's position towards Qatar has really evolved from early on to nodding with the blockade and said, okay, we get it. The Trump administration did nothing to stand in the way of that. But now they're evolving and saying, look, we really need to resolve this because it's in the U.S. best interest that we have cooperation among the Gulf countries, of which obviously the U.S. has tremendous interest there, biggest base in Qatar, et cetera. But a new development, and we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and I was complaining about the fact that Saudi Arabia was having an emergency summit, and they hadn't invited the Emir of Qatar. Now that changed. Last week, Qatar said it's been invited to the two summits. They invited the Emir, and Mohammed bin Salman is planning to, I guess, meet with the Emir of Qatar. Is this as big as a development as I think it is, or is it cosmetic?
Well, I've been looking. This, first of all, the Emir's not going, and I personally think that's the right decision because he's sending the prime minister, and the prime minister is a very experienced. He's 60 years old. He's been the Minister of Interior. He is the Minister of Interior. He's handled a lot of security issues over the years. He's very experienced, and he's essentially the second-ranking guy in Qatar. Very, very savvy. So he's going to go, and I think from the standpoint of the Emir, that's the right decision because I don't think the Emir could risk going and not being, and frankly, not, and being disrespected in some way by people there. That would have been, frankly, very damaging domestically for him. And the prime minister is aware of all the issues. And I was reading this about what the Middle East experts were saying about this, and unanimously, none of them think it would be a big breakthrough. I do think it's important, though, because I think as we talked a couple weeks ago, if this embargo is going to change, it's probably going to just erode slowly. Little things will happen over time. And this could be a first sort of nail in the coffin for that. So I do think it's important. I think it's important that the Prime Minister goes. He sure knows what he's doing. And we'll see what happens. But for the United States, this is a high priority. They've got to have a unified front against Iran, and they can't have the Gulf Cooperation Council break up, and it is under huge stress right now.
Right, so you would agree with me that the Trump administration has evolved here when they were first presented with the blockade. They kind of went with it. They bought into the Saudis and UAE's complaints about it, but now I think, am I right in saying that the Trump administration seems to have evolved on it, and now they see the risks of this conflict ongoing and how it's not in our best interest?
Oh, absolutely. I think first of all, they realize the enormous security implications of having this blockade persist. And secondly, I really have to give credit to the government of Qatar for how they handled this. I mean, things they did like maintain energy shipments to the United Arab Emirates. They supply a third of the energy in the United Arab Emirates. And when they were blockaded, they continued to ship that energy there. In other words, they took the high road during this blockade. They didn't expel the 300,000 Egyptian guest workers. And that's in a very positive message, I think, to everyone. They not only were wronged, but they also took a very they always indicated that they were willing to settle, and they were not going to cut off ties with their neighbors despite the damage that the blockade had done.
Well, look, I think that that has been one of the biggest accomplishments. And look, I agree with you. I guess the fact that Mohammed bin Salman invited the Emir of Qatar to their emergency summit, a good move. Also, your position, which also makes sense to me, which is the Emir made the right decision in declining the personal invitation, but sending the Prime Minister, because you got to take baby steps, right?
Right,
and
every government, including the Emir of Qatar, has a domestic constituency, and I think he might have been a little apprehensive. I certainly would have been about how he might have been received at that conference. But again, the Prime Minister went. That's a very respectable representation.
So, Ambassador Patterson, you would agree with me then that the fact that Qatar is going to the summit is really a huge development, and I think your position is the blockade will not be ended with a ceremony. It'll just erode and go away, right? So this would be a step in that direction.
I think if it does disappear, that's how it'll disappear. It'll disappear gradually. I think this is an important step. Again, I emphasize that most of the people who are experts in this area think this is sort of a one-off, that the blockade will continue. But the fact that it's in the holy cities, that he got an invitation from the Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Then he got an invitation from Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis directly. So all this sort of symbolism matters in the Middle East, maybe more than it would elsewhere. And then, of course, the other thing is we're just sending additional troops to Al Udeid. So let's not forget the security implications of that huge air base that we have there. I think that was the other thing that made the Trump administration position evolve. They realized the importance of that air base, and then, of course, Qatar stepped up to the plate and is sponsoring a huge expansion of the air base at its own expense.
As we've said for a long time, the truth can only be held down for so long, and then finally it bubbles up to the top. And I think that's what's happened. And it seems like the Trump administration is now moving in the right direction with this understanding that they need a unified Gulf in order to move forward with our own best interest in that region, including standing up to Iran. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. I always love having you on. Ambassador Ann Patterson, President, U.S. Qatar Council. She was also former U.S. Ambassador to Egypt and Pakistan and served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs 2013 to 2017. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. Always enjoy your unique perspective. Thank you.